Today we're going to have our lecture on the introduction to Islam and the Umayyad dynasty. So obviously Islam translates as submission to God. The beginning is founded with Muhammad, who is very well known, and obviously Mecca is the center of the faith as it exists now in the Sunni religion. As we have here, Muhammad was born in 578 or 580 in the city of Mecca. His father had died before his birth. His mother died while he was still a small child. At the age of 35, he married a widow, a wealthy widow, who was much older. And they had 6 children. And the daughters, obviously, were the ones who carried the faith forward, as the sons had died prematurely. By 611, Muhammad had received a calling from Archangel Gabriel to preach righteousness to the desert dwellers, to the Arabs. But not having many followers, and especially at 619, after the death of his wife, he left Mecca without a protector in town, and being a religious prophet, he left to go to Medina. Now, this is called the Hijra, which is not an expulsion or an exile, but the loss of one's homeland for the sake of one's religious faith. So he went to Medina, which eventually would be called, nicknamed the City of the Prophet. It's now seen as the beginning, the moment when the Islamic State was founded. So Muhammad went to Medina, immediately was able to attain political and spiritual power and authority over the local Arab populations, and therefore that's where he started to gain his power base. After assembling an army and many followers, the goal was to regain Mecca. So that is the Hajj. The Hajj is to regain Mecca. The battles continued throughout the 620s, reaching a culmination in AD 632 when Mecca was won again by Muhammad and his followers. So Mecca is the Great Hajj. It is always the return to Mecca. Unfortunately, Muhammad died again in 632, just a little while after regaining that city. So what is Islam? What is the faith that Muhammad professed? It is based on what is called the Hadith, the body of traditions. So there are early documents or early narratives that set out the rules and regulations that govern the behaviors of Muslims. We always hear about the 5 basic requirements or commands for those who believe in the faith. So here we have them. So it's belief in one God, Allah, and Muhammad as his prophet. The second one is daily prayers. As you may know, there are prayers set out at different times of the day, from daybreak all the way to sunset, so 5 prayers a day. Almsgiving. There's a very strong emphasis on charity within the religion. We'll get to, especially in the Ottoman Empire, there were issues or questions that many wealthy people were unable to engage in almsgiving, engage in charity, because they couldn't find any poverty or many people in need. So quite often when we talk about almsgiving in the Islamic cultures, we're talking about taking care of widows, taking care of orphans, funding hospitals, and many of those things are still going on today in Islamic communities around the world. Fasting, perhaps you've heard about Ramadan. So there are certain designated months and days when the faithful are not allowed to eat as the light is shining. And obviously very important is the pilgrimage to Mecca And that again is a repeat of Muhammad's return to Mecca late in his life in order to pay the respects. And the Kaaba is obviously the focus of the attentions once one returns to Mecca. So we'll look at that in a few moments. So first we're going to look at various Umayyad sites. Now, the Umayyad was the first dynasty of Islam. So with the Prophet dying in 632, the Umayyad dynasty, as we see here, began with Muhammad's daughter, Rakaya, married into the family. So that becomes the first Islamic state. It becomes the very first Islamic identified country, culture, empire. You probably also hear very often about the Shiites and the Sunnis. So, as I mentioned, it was Muhammad's daughters which carried the faith onward, especially through very strategic marriages with wealthy power brokers throughout the Middle East. So the Umayyad was one of those first families that created these very important political alliances and inherited the religious authority of Muhammad's daughters. So the Shiites are those who believe that their faith and their leaders come from the daughters and their marriages. So they actually feel a genealogy going back to Muhammad himself. The Sunnis believe in elected leaders, so therefore it is outside of the genealogy coming from Muhammad. So the Umayyad, as I said, is the first of the empires we're going to be looking at. This section of the course is very traditional art history, various cultures of successive time periods in various countries. So it represents the beginning of the period of expansionism of the faith, political as well as religious expansion. The term that we use for that is Dar al-Islam, which means the world of Islam. So Umayyad is generally around 650 to 750. We're talking about approximately 100 years, but it demonstrates that with that marriage in the 630s, that Umayyad takes on the responsibility of carrying on the faith. And in just 100 years or so, Islam becomes a very major player, not just in the Middle East, but throughout all of Asia and actually even into areas of North Africa. Now, the issue of appropriation we're going to discuss a little bit later. So appropriation is a very important issue, as well as the Arab mentality that the faith began with desert dwellers. So those are two issues we're going to be looking at prominently in today's lecture. So here we have a photographic image of the Kaaba in Mecca. I'm sure you've all seen it in the news. So it is this cube. Kaaba actually means cube. And around that cube, during the Hajj period, millions of people make their circumambulation. Similar to Buddhism and Hinduism, you walk around it in a clockwise fashion. You walk around it many times as you say your prayers. And through your closeness to the Kaaba, you are able to feel that essence of spirituality that is coming from it. Okay, but what is the Kaaba? And this brings us to another symbol that we're going to see quite often within Islam. So here I'll tell you a story that comes from the Quran. So Archangel Gabriel, and that is the same angel who told Mary she's going to bear a child, which was Christ. So Christ, according to Islam, is a prophet, like Muhammad is a prophet. So there is a sense of consistency or a relationship, a kinship to the Judeo-Christian traditions. It doesn't deny Jesus or Mary or the Immaculate Conception that is the basis of Christianity. But it seems that they phrase or contextualize Christ as a prophet. So one who was of spiritual power, spiritual force, of righteousness, who is also a role model for those who are faithful. So Gabriel led Muhammad by night to a heavenly vision. So again, as I said before, it was Gabriel who appeared to Muhammad and gave him the calling to follow this path of faith and preach righteousness to the Arabs. So Muhammad saw in this mystical vision the sinners, the wind-blown ashes of their deeds, burning in the fires of regret, the fires of hell. Then Gabriel showed him the gardens of eternity, where flowers and trees represent good deeds and prayer. So glory be to him who transported his servant by night from the sacred mosque to the further mosque. So Gabriel showed him the way. Gabriel showed him the vision. Gabriel gave him the motivation in order to reach and ascend to the role of prophet. So here the Quran says Muhammad prayed with Jesus and the prophets of the scriptures in the further mosque, meaning the heavenly zone, the symbol of human soul and worship, of which the Kaaba and other temples are earthly reflections. Well, what exactly is this cube? Of course, there are many stories, so I'm going to relate from the Quran a few little anecdotes. So we have to think of the Kaaba as the holy throne on earth. So we go all the way back to the story of Genesis and the beginning of creation. Adam was immensely tall. His head, which still wore a wreath of starry leaves, almost reached the celestial spheres from which he had come. Remember, Adam was made in God's image. So Adam was immensely tall, very cosmic, and his head almost reached the heavens. He stood there upon the mountain, motionless, trying to hear the echoes of the angels singing as they circled round God's throne. But as darkness fell, the angels were so moved by the sight of this enormous creature, Adam, in silent despair that they prayed it might be taken from them. So here we have a problem that Adam, God's image on earth, is he an earthly being or a heavenly being? And there is much confusion there. So God heard the confusion, God heard the prayers, and reduced Adam's size until he was in proportion with other creatures on earth. So being stripped of his superiority, he now became a humble earthen vessel, complete yet incomplete, a clod of sensitive flesh. As his height was diminished, Adam could no longer hear the angels' songs in heaven. So on earth came the reply, Adam is naught but what he has striven for. O man, verily thou strivest upon the hard way towards thy Lord, and thou wilt meet him. So God urged Adam to seek his own throne on earth. So Adam is going to live a parallel existence to God Almighty in heaven on his throne. Adam is going to have the same stature within his own throne on earth. So God said, go find your own throne. In wonder, Adam looked around him. The dried leaves had fallen from his wreath and fertilized the ground. Where they lay there now grew beautiful trees. But Adam could not stay in the sweet-scented land, for he had to find his own throne. So following God's words, Adam journeyed north, south, east, west, from Asia Minor, Mount Lebanon, Mount of Olives, Sinai, the Red Coast. Adam saw in the distance a range of rocky peaks running from north to south along the shore. So he entered the Hijaz, through gorges, through the winds, through the deserts, shining black pyramids of rock. But when he saw the black pyramids of rock, the black rock, he knew that must be the navel of the earth, the axis of God's throne, round which the earth had spun as it came into being. So you always hear about the black rock. So on a small elevation in the midst of the sand, there was a baldachin. A baldachin is how to say it? It is like a canopy. So supported on 4 columns, 4 emerald columns in this case, and the roof of a giant ruby. So it's like an open canopy. It's like an outdoor 4 columns with a little roof, very open air. Under the baldachins, shining so brightly that it illumined the whole valley, lay a pearly white stone, the symbol of man's soul. So Adam walked around it in a circular fashion and declared that that must be it. That is the navel of the earth. That is the throne of God on earth. Okay, so that's the Kaaba. That's what this is. And you hear about the black rock, which Adam recognized as being the source of that power. That's how he recognized it. So the black rock, you cannot see in Mecca, but actually if you go to Istanbul, when the Ottomans had dominion over much of the Middle East, they actually took a piece of the black rock back to Istanbul, and you actually can see a piece of it there. Even later on, even after Adam met Eve and all of their stories, it is actually believed that death came to Adam in Mecca. So his son Seth buried him in a cave, the highest mountain of the Mecca area, and it's all related. So Mecca is not just associated with Adam on earth, the throne of God on earth, the black rock, but also the death of Adam on earth. There are also other stories that highly value this particular location, and we're going into the future by many centuries, and that is the whole story of Abraham. So much of many of the issues between the Arabs and the Semites or the Jews goes back to the story of Abraham, that had the wife Sarah, who was unable to conceive. So therefore Sarah, recognizing the need for Abraham to have a child, told him to have a child with a servant, Hagar. But eventually Sarah does have a child, Ishmael. So Abraham has divided responsibilities and divided devotions to the 2 sons, one legitimate, one illegitimate. So when Sarah commanded Abraham, you better take Hagar and Ishmael out of my household, where do they go? So they go to this site. They go to the site of the Kaaba. So 1,000 years after Noah's flood, 2 people came walking across the desert. The man, tall and elderly, was the prophet Abraham, born in the land of Babel of the Semitic race. His companion was Hagar, a comely Egyptian girl carrying in her arms their child Ishmael. So, as was commanded, Abraham leaves Hagar and Ishmael there in the desert. Where? Here, at this particular site. At this time, Mecca was desolate. No one lived there. There was no water. but Abraham abandoned the mother and the child in this place. He left them simply a bag of dates and a leather bottle of water and left. So Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, ran after him. Abraham, why are you leaving us like this? What, we're going to die? A desert where there's no one and nothing? But Abraham didn't turn back. How has God commanded this? It's God's command. So the mother of Ishmael tried to take care of her child, drank the remaining water, but eventually it was the Arabs who came to take care of her. So that's another story that is related to this particular site of the Kaaba. So it's very closely connected, not just with Genesis, with Adam, but also with Ishmael, who will be the originator or the father of the Arab tribe. What we see again in this slide is the homage to that holy site, is a detail of the cube. So Kaaba actually means cube. The structure that we see here was built much later in the Ottoman Empire. So we are not exactly very sure how much of it was visible, how much of the black rock was visible during all of those centuries from the late 600s all the way up to the Ottoman era. But as you see right now, it's all very enclosed as a part of this sacred space. So what survives of Muhammad's lifetime? So here we just have a ground plan. And this is Muhammad's house. And it's a very typical Arab house. So we need to discuss it because it serves as the inspiration, as the ground plan for Islamic religious buildings. As he was the prophet, obviously his house is going to be the prototype. Now, as we see, in the left is just the drawing, the aerial drawing, the ground plan. On the right is more of a angled three-dimensional image. The most important part of any of these, we can call it a compound, is the wide open interior space. So we see a very open courtyard. And because of the very hot climate in this part of the world, there are very few times during the year when you want to be enclosed in four walls. Because for most of the year, you want to be outside to get maximum benefit of whatever breezes may arise. So therefore, much of the living was actually conducted outdoors. So it's a very large courtyard with either covered walkways. So in terms of the ground plan on the left, you see that in the top left, it simply is columns with a roof line to give some shading from the sun. And then we see on the right side of that drawing, there we have individual rooms. So the rooms are relatively small. You have covered walkways to shield from the sun, but most of the space is completely open. So it's columns. So what are your building components? You have columns, you have roof lines, and a few rooms. That's it. It's a very simple concept because the desert dwellers mostly lived in the outdoor environment. So when we get to the Umayyad, we have a few buildings that have survived. Again, Umayyad is about 650 to 750. Some people date the actual beginning of that collective consciousness of Dar al-Islam and the Umayyad Empire. Some date as early as 640, some date as late as 660 for the origination. As I said, it lasts about 100 years. So what we see here is obviously the most important of all of the surviving structures of the Umayyad dynasty. This one, the Dome of the Rock, was built in 687, so it's still a 7th century. You have to keep in mind that Muhammad died in 632. This monument to the faith was only built 50 years later. What is most impressive about Islam is the speed of its growth, the speed of the conversions, the number of empires, the number of royal families, dynasties that adopted the faith. That Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, is extremely not just geographically expansive, but it is on fire. It just is extremely fast, and people run to the faith very, very quickly. The positive of that is that it creates a sense of an international community that many other religions had not been able to accomplish. So whether it's Arabs in Arabia, or whether it's Persians in Iran, or whether it is today Pakistanis or people in Indonesia, it doesn't matter what the country, so it's from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, there's a sense of community that transcends ethnicity, race, many of those other barriers that are prominent in other political and religious structures. So as I said, the Dome of the Rock was begun in 687. Most accounts say the construction was completed by 691, 692. All of these original sites during the Umayyad have some spiritual significance. We're going to look inside. It's not a mosque. It is a sanctuary. It's a rock sanctuary. And again, it's a holy site because this is where Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed as per God's orders. If you remember the story that is recounted in the Judeo-Christian traditions, God always tried to test his prophets in order to check their faith. So when, as we already mentioned, Abraham sent away Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham still had Isaac by his wife Sarah. God tried to test Abraham and said, now I want to see if you're willing to sacrifice Isaac. Obviously, Abraham gave up one child. Is Abraham going to give up a second child, especially after it took so long for his barren wife to eventually produce a child? But Abraham, being the dutiful prophet, he followed God's words, went to the top of the mount, and proceeded to sacrifice his son. If you know the story, at that very, very, very last moment before Abraham was going to slice his son's neck, the angel comes down, holds Abraham's hand, and says, oh, this was only a test. So instead of sacrificing your son, you can sacrifice this goat that is standing by in a thicket. So it ended up that Abraham sacrificed a goat. See, in English it works. I don't know if in other languages it does, but it's like, oh, you have to sacrifice your kid. And American slang, your kid is like your child, but kid is also in Jewish traditions is a goat, a young goat. So I don't know if Abraham just got confused or whether God was playing some semantic little game with Abraham. Anyways, this is the site where supposedly Abraham took uh, Isaac up to the mount and was about to sacrifice him, Mount Moriah. But it also has another significance. Like the Kaaba has various narratives interwoven, whether it's Abraham looking for God's throne on earth, or whether it's Adam looking for God's throne on earth, whether it's Abraham with Ishmael and Hagar, the death of Adam, the Dome of the Rock not only has Abraham and Isaac, but it is also believed to be the site where Muhammad ascended to earth. So that means that Muhammad died in Mecca in 632. He was miraculously transported to this site in Jerusalem, and it's from here that he ascended to heaven. So supposedly, we can see his footprints within this building. Okay, now I mentioned a word a few moments ago, and that word is appropriation, and it is extremely vital for the understanding of Islam. Judaism started obviously in the BC era. Christianity began, and our calendar, Christianity is the transition from the BC to the AD calendar, marking events around Christ's birth and death. Islam came 600 years after the death of Christ, being the last of the world's religions. Its main focus is on converting those who believe in other faiths. And as we've mentioned throughout this course, you have to speak to people in a language they know. And that also is appropriate for art. So appropriation means the adoption, the adaptation of previous narratives, of previous visual images, taking them as your own in order to create that transition into a new faith. So when we look at Islamic buildings, we continually discuss, what do they borrow from this culture? What do they borrow from that culture? What is similar to this religion or that religion? So that's why I said at the onset that our discussion of Islamic art is going to be more traditional art history, because what influences apparent here? Is this from Greece? Is this from Rome? Is this from the Mediterranean? Where are they getting A, B, and C? Because they want to begin with traditions and visual images and symbols and metaphors that people do understand, and not make the religion seem so alien, so absolutely different. So the Dome of the Rock, as we see it here, is 8-sided. It is a rock sanctuary. Again, that'll be clear when we get inside. The columns, that's what a Roman column looks like. Or, and because all this was originally Roman Empire, so you see those in Phoenicia, you see those through Syria and Lebanon, through actual Coptic Egypt. So many of the things we're going to see are a compilation of many of these artistic traditions that have been in this area of Israel, Judea, for centuries before the birth and life of Muhammad. It is a centralized building, meaning that if you slice it down the center, left, right, front, back, it's all equal. An eight-sided building is obviously harmonious, regardless of what angle you look at it. And in the very center, symmetrically in the middle, you have a dome. So it's the Golden Dome, as you see in this image. So here we have an aerial view of it. So there you see the eight-sided structure with the gold dome in the center. It is symmetrical from all sides. And that makes it what we call centralized. The dome is at the center, equal distance from the dome to the walls on any of those eight sides. So that's symmetry, balance. It's not new. It is based on a Roman concept of a baptistry. But what is a baptistry? A baptistry is the introduction into a new faith. So that's what this is. It's an introduction into a new faith. So I'm not sure how much is new in Islam, but it is a recombination of many elements that have already existed within the realm of visual communication and art. So here we have a cross section of the building. So we've already discussed this. You have the interior central space with a passageway to allow people to walk in a clockwise fashion. So again, you're still walking around in a clockwise fashion around a sacred central space. We saw that in the stupa with Sanchi and Barhut. You walk around the outside, and we also have that in Hindu temples. You walk around the outside corridor with a Garbhagriha in the center. Okay? So, and in Roman Catholicism, in a baptistry, you have the altar in the center, and you walk around it is the aisle where people can stand in order to watch the holy event happening in the central space. So here we have a photo of the interior of the Dome of the Rock. Obviously, it's one of the major monuments in the world. Obviously, some people cannot enter because of political issues between the Jews and the Muslims today, that Jews mostly stay away from this site. I take for granted that you know some of these background issues, but what is the actual territory? The Dome of the Rock is built upon the remains of the original Temple of Solomon. You all know about the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. You see images, videos of Jews praying at the wall. That is the only surviving wall of the original Temple of Solomon and of David that exists to our day in Jerusalem. The temple survived all the way to the AD era, but the Romans in various campaigns in the AD 60s and 70s passed laws that criminalized various religions, various sects that were contrary to the Roman faith, the Roman gods. So in the conquest of Jerusalem during the Roman Empire, the conquest of Judea, the temple was destroyed. So all that survives to this day of the BC era temple is the Western Wall. The Dome of the Rock is built on the higher levels of those remains of the Temple of Jerusalem. So that's also appropriation. So not only are they copying the Roman Catholic concept of a baptism, not only they're copying the sense of a holy interior space with an aisle where you walk around in a circular fashion, but they're also building the structure at a location that was previously holy to the Jews. So there are many levels of political decision-making here in order to demonstrate the ascendancy of Islam over the religions of the past, what they perceive to be the religions of the past. Now, what we see in this photograph, obviously it's a very beautiful photograph. There are beautiful rugs on the floor. The columns are of the most beautiful granite and marble. The wall surfaces, the ceiling surfaces are covered with beautiful golden tiles, mosaics. Obviously, this is extremely elaborate as it represents the Holy of Holies. But again, here you see the aisle. So I like this interior photograph. You have a sense of how you walk around that interior space, and the fact that there are windows on all sides, light is coming in from various directions. So here we're on the second floor looking down, and there's the rock. So you're seeing the rock from up above. This is what's in the center space of the Dome of the Rock. It is a rock sanctuary. And that, again, is the holy rock where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac, and that is the rock from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. So it's all about the rock. There is no altar. It's not a place of weekly prayers. It's just the holy site where the prophets have actually tread. Here we have a slightly distorted view. We're standing on the main level and we're looking across at the rock. So you see the unevenness of the rock, and people believe they actually can see the footprints of the prophet upon that surface before he ascended up to heaven. That was like a springboard. And the next slide is the rock again. He actually levitated up from this surface. Another extremely famous monument of the Umayyad dynasty was the Mosque of Damascus. All right, so Muhammad's daughter, one of his daughters, marries into the Umayyad dynasty. You already have Mecca as a capital of Islam. As Muhammad's daughter marries into the Umayyad, all of a sudden the Umayyad dynasty is investing in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem becomes another capital of Islam. And then actually the main center point of the Umayyad dynasty is Damascus. So you now have, again, within 30, 40, 50 years of Muhammad's death, three capitals of Islam: Mecca, Jerusalem, and Damascus. So you're quickly expanding your power base and the force of the religion. The mosque at Damascus is later. It is in the beginning of the 700s. We generally say the year 715. But what was this site? This site was originally a Roman temple, a pagan temple. So obviously a temple dedicated to Jupiter. So obviously this shows that Islam is now built upon the ashes of the Roman Empire and the Roman faith. But this was also, from the Roman temple of Jupiter, this actually was a Catholic church. So again, the Umayyads are using a Catholic location, a Catholic building, in order to grow their religion. So whereas the Dome of the Rock used Jewish imagery and Jewish identity and Jewish locations in order to build this new identity for the community as Islam, here we're doing the same thing. It was a Roman location becoming a Catholic location, now becoming an Islamic location. And it was a church. And what is the holy relic for this church? The head of St. John the Baptist. So to this day is believed that the head of St. John the Baptist, you know the story, the older cousin of Jesus, who actually baptized Jesus in the Jordan River. His head is here. You may also know the story about Salome and the head of St. John the Baptist. So as a martyr for the faith, they actually believe that his head is located at this location. So take a location that is very, very holy to current religions, appropriate it as your own, and grow your religion from there. So parts of what we see here were actually older than this mosque. So let's look at it. Here we have an aerial view. We see the open courtyard. So obviously that is now going to be an essential part of mosques. So the Dome of the Rock was not a mosque. It's a sanctuary, holy of holy, in order to value that holy rock. But here it is a mosque. So you have the open courtyard. You have various columns and porches, porticos around the courtyard in order to provide shade from the sun. So again, it actually is very similar to the Prophet's house in Medina. And on one side, you have the actual interior space, the building. You can also see embedded into the wall the minaret, and that is a tall tower that the imam climbs 5 times a day in order to call the faithful to prayer. That's another form of appropriation, because when the imam climbs the minaret in order to call people to prayer and to actually say the prayers, it is to resonate throughout the community, or even larger, throughout the entire city. So therefore, in early Damascus, Christians, Jews, or people of other faith would be listening to Islamic prayers maybe 5 times a day. So therefore, not only the appropriating a holy space, they're also appropriating the airwaves and communicating throughout the whole community their messaging. So here we're in the courtyard. We see this wide open space. There is one requirement for that open space. Before walking into the mosque itself, you need to be able to wash your hands and wash your feet. So there must be water. It's not holy water, it's not blessed water, nothing like that. There is a necessity for, we call it ablution, which is just cleansing. So cleansing your feet and hands before you walk into the building. So you may have, at many mosques, even today, you may have like one faucet, you may have multiple faucets, maybe in multiple places where you can wash up before you walk into the building. In this case, we have a couple of these little pavilions within the courtyard. So a couple may be for washing, they may be for holding sacred objects, or even the head of St. John the Baptist. So on one side of the courtyard, you actually have the building itself. So you see that on the left of the slide. Again, there is this porch running along the length as you transition from the bright sunlight towards the interior. Also in Damascus, we have many of those same types of mosaic patterns as we had at the Dome of the Rock on that surface by the entryway. So here we have a closer view of the entryway into the actual prayer hall. So the mosque is the total complex. We're going to walk into the prayer hall. So the visual imagery in the mosaics is going to be from what I said at the Quran when Archangel Gabriel showed Muhammad the beautiful heavenly vision of the ideal world. For desert dwellers, the ideal world is lush, it's green, has a tremendous amount of vegetation, has plentiful water. For most cultures, heaven represents the beautiful opposite of the geography in which they live. In India, for Shiva and Parvati, they lived on Mount Kailasa, which is forever green, forever lush. It's in the Himalayas. It represents a realm very different from the desert, hot, arid reality of a majority of the population. Same with the Arabs. Obviously, the ideal is is to have plentiful amounts of water, is to have beautiful vegetation. It's like living in a vast oasis. It has that sense of fertility and plentifulness that is so rare in the desert region. So in the mosaics, you have a lot of trees, a lot of lush vegetation, and typical, you have many images of garden pavilions and beautiful landscapes. Of two mosaics. Okay, the one on the top left is from the Mosque of Damascus. It's not from the outside, it's actually from the inside of the building, of the prayer hall. On the bottom right, we have an image from a Greek, early Byzantine church. So I'm making a comparison here between the Islamic image and the Eastern Orthodox image, both pretty much around the same time. Whereas the one on the left is 700s, I would say the one on the bottom right is about the 600s, so a little bit earlier. But it's the same type of building. It's the same type of architectural construction. It's still a gold background, and it's not very three-dimensional in terms of the image. The buildings are not put together in terms of perspective. It's a very abstract concept of a celestial palace in a golden realm with beautiful trees. It is an other world, far distant, far different, and much more phenomenal than anything. Like we said in Hinduism, supra-normal. It is beyond anything that is normal, anything that is typical in our earthly existence. So I show this pairing because I want you to see the appropriation. There's no need to start things from scratch or to be totally creative. Why can't you just adopt what's already there for your own needs? So I think this is an extremely close comparison. Now, in terms of locations, one is Greece and one is Damascus. That may seem very far, but it really is not that far. And artists who would be hired to work on the elaborate decorative program of the Mosque of Damascus, they would have had knowledge of early Byzantine art and late Roman Empire art. So it's not so unusual that artists at the time would be fully informed of international styles. So here we're in the interior of the Mosque at Damascus. Mosques, the prayer halls, are wide open spaces. They are not subdivided into rooms. They're wide open spaces. When you go into a mosque, you just take the next space. It's supposed to be a communal hall where everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status, prays together, closely together, in rows. You go in, you take the first space, the next person takes the second space. It doesn't matter who you are. It builds a sense of community. As I said, regardless of rich and poor, profession, or any other aspect of identity. You all face in one direction, and that is the Qibla wall. And the Qibla wall is the wall that faces towards Mecca. So if you're Damascus, you're facing south. There were some periods, during the Umayyad, many of the mosques were built oriented towards Jerusalem, because the Umayyads wanted to favor Jerusalem rather than the Arab Mecca. So some are oriented to Jerusalem, some are oriented to Mecca, but it still is generally for Damascus, you're looking southward. So it's similar to in Roman Catholic churches. They're all supposed to be oriented that when you pray, you're facing Jerusalem. So there is a similar concept of the orientation of these structures towards the holy site of the religion. So everyone faces in one direction, and that is the wall that represents the direction that is towards Mecca. That's the Qibla wall. Within that Qibla wall, there is an arch, which is called the Mihrab arch. And that arch is a narrow, vertical type of arch, like the Oji arch that we saw in Buddhism. It's slightly pointed at the top. It's like a door with an arch at the top of it. It's that type of shape. Some people say it's shaped like a missile. It's shaped like a rocket. And that simply is a metaphor pointing upward. So it's a vertical marker that we should always keep our minds on the ascent towards heaven. So when you go into a Muslim building, or when you stay in a hotel in a Muslim country, you always see various arrows. So the arrows orient you towards Mecca, so you can say your prayer, when you're within any of these rooms, you know exactly where to face. And also, you have to be cognizant that heaven is up above. So, Qibla wall towards Mecca, and the minaret arch that points vertically. That's all that exists within a mosque. There is nothing else within a mosque. It is an open space prayer hall for the community of congregants. There's nothing else. That's all that's necessary in a building. So it's one large interior space, and the number of columns, the design of the columns is either local style, or it's simply to create greater efficiencies to open up as much floor space as possible to accommodate a maximum number of people. Actually men, but maximum amounts of people. Because this was originally founded on a Catholic church, obviously many of the columns we see here are not just from the Christian era, but many of these columns are also from the Roman era, because as I said before, this was originally a site of a temple of Jupiter. So appropriation, they're using old columns, they're using old blocks of stone, they're using people's images of gardens and heavenly zones, they're using other people's holy spaces. That's appropriation. So here we have some details of mosaics. We'll just go through them very briefly, but very typical. The gold background, which emphasizes the heavenly aura, because in our world on Earth, we have sky, and the sky is generally blue, or a cloudy sky is white and gray. A golden background on an image immediately transports the scene to a heavenly realm that is far beyond our understanding. And our concept is that heaven, where God lives, where God resides, is up above, and it has this continual sense of golden glow because of its proximity to the sun and God himself. So the golden background is equated with the heavenly sphere. But again, we see images that are extremely otherworldly, abstract, simplified. This is an image we've seen many times. It's the pot with the flowers growing as an old symbol of fertility and of plenty. Here's another one of these garden pavilions. So all of these represent that heavenly sphere that if you live a righteous life, this is where you will be in existence for all eternity. But I have to say, even in this example, that when you look at that garden pavilion in the front, the way it is like a semicircle moving backward, the perspective, the space is totally wrong, but that's copied from a Roman painting and Roman mosaics. So in Pompeii and Herculaneum, there are so many Roman images from the BC era and the first century AD where there are garden pavilions that look exactly like that. So again, even that distortion and abstraction has already been done before. Here's another garden pavilion, one of the more famous ones. So here's a garden pavilion, again, in this heavenly golden realm. So these are mosaics on the walls on the inside of that mosque. So it's simply just background decoration, but reinforces that concept of the splendor of the heavenly realm. So besides the Dome of the Rock and the Mosque at Damascus, the other famous or well-known constructions that have survived to our date are more political residential. They're not religious structures. So we have two of these caravan stops that are in modern day Jordan, in eastern Jordan towards the deserts. As we see in this ground plan, again, you have your large courtyard, you have various buildings for those who are stopping there for overnight on the way back and forth Jerusalem, the Mediterranean, and the interior areas of Babylon or Iraq or Baghdad or Persia. So obviously a tremendous amount of travel at this time. It's like the caravan stops that we have in the Caucasus and other countries. It's a hotel, B&B, with various rooms for washing, rooms for eating, rooms for cooking, and obviously also spaces for the animals, for the horses, for the camels, for the herds if you're taking animals from one city to the next. So here we have an image of one of these. So you see buildings of different sides. Some are for, as I said, like a bathroom building, for showers, for washing. Some are for sleeping, some are for eating, and so forth. But what is most interesting about these caravan stops is that we have some paintings that have survived. And this brings up a whole other issue. And that is the presence of visual imagery, narratives, the representation of people within this Dar al-Islam, within this Islamic world. Now, obviously, there is a relationship between the Islamic and the Jewish interpretations of the Ten Commandments. You may know that there is the commandment, thou shalt not make a graven image unto thee, that humans are not to create images of people or images of earthly reality within their artwork. In Jewish art, many artists are very abstract as they try to represent something different from what is seen. That is also the case in Islam, but that doesn't mean in Islam we don't have images of people. We don't have images of daily life. We have to draw the distinction between imagery for religious buildings and imagery for a house or a domestic setting. So in Islam, we do have the concept towards, well, let's do it this way, that in the book, we mentioned the Hadith, which is the book of rules and regulations that govern moral behavior within the religion. Now, the Quran contains no prohibition against the representation of people. There's nothing in the Quran that says you can't create an image of a man or a woman or any earthly reality. So there's nothing compulsory that artists can or cannot do something. But the issue is that God created the world. What we see is God's creation. God created Adam. God created humanity. God created the geology, the geography, the meteorology, the biology, the zoology, the botany. God created everything that we observed, and we observe daily in our lives. But can a human equate themselves with God in terms of being a creator? An artist is a creator. An artist also creates worlds. An artist creates people. An artist creates images of mountains and animals and plants. So if an artist in a painting or an artist in a sculpture visualizes and produces a worldview, is it going to be seen as competing with a worldview as envisioned by God? That is the issue. So, of course, these discussions have been going on in the BC era, in the Judeo-Christian traditions, and in the AD era. But again, we have to look larger. And in this time period, we're obviously in the 700s, the beginning of the 700s. In 687, there was a decree in the Roman Catholic Church against the production of icons. You all know icons because icons are in every church in Armenia. They are the small portable paintings on wood representing the saints and the role models of the faith, the narratives of the faith. Because in the Roman Catholic tradition, they became very worried that people were praying to these paintings and not praying to Mary, not praying to Gabriel, not praying to God and Jesus. That the icon image was being invested with too much authority. People actually thought, oh, God is living in that painting. Oh, Mary can actually hear me because I'm talking to that painting that represents her. So the Roman Catholic Church banned icons. And this ban would go on for almost 200 years. So it's unclear whether Islam, when it started to debate the concept of the visual arts within its religious sphere, whether it was an influence of the Roman Catholic Church against icons and the dangers icons can bring, that is the reason why Islam started to adopt an anti-visual imagery, an anti-naturalism, an anti-earthly aspect in their arts. We really obviously don't know. But there is an edict in 721. Okay, so that's at the time of the Mosque of Damascus. That's at the time of these caravan stops we're seeing. In 721, there was an edict of Yazid that said all religious images were to be destroyed. And this governed over Judea, over Syria, and that all such images of humans were to be replaced with images of plants and vegetation. Maybe that's why we have all those images of garden pavilions with no people. Remember, all those images we saw at the Mosque of Damascus, no people. Very few animals, if any. So that came down in 721. So there is a shift away from some of the traditional art imagery to imagery of vegetation and plants. Okay, so that obviously impacted, Damascus and other things we have seen. But we also have some other justifications for this shift. This was attributed to the prophet. Angels will not enter a house in which there is a pitcher or a dog. Well, that should also be a rule in Armenia because of all of the absolutely nasty street dogs that are emissaries of the devil. But the sense of equating a dirty animal, because they consider in Islam, dog is dirty, dog should not be in the house. So in Muslim countries, you rarely have a pet dog. That brings up an issue. When brother and I were traveling years ago in Uzbekistan, and we had some very good guides. They were curators from museums and very, educated, and they had studied in the United States and made international conference presentations. But we were in her town. It was Bokhara. And she was walking us through her neighborhood, and we were passing, there were people walking down the street, and some had pet dogs. And then I said, "Oh, people here have dogs." And she said, "Oh yes, she has a pet dog too." So my response was, "Well, then angels won't come into your house, because in Islam, angels won't come in a house where there's a dog." And she looked at me. It was very funny, very funny. So then, of course, the answer is, well, yeah, we're not that conservative, Muslims. Okay, so the angels will not enter a house in which there is a pitcher or a dog. So it says that even artists, people who make images or make pictures, will actually end up being in hell. So it's a strange dichotomy. There are many issues at play here, whether it's more of an international movement against visual imagery and earthly imagery in art, because it's considered to be too luxurious, it's too distracting, it is too superfluous, and it leads the mind away from the austerity needed for religious contemplation. Okay, but we do have examples even after 700, and that's what we're going to be seeing in the next few lectures, of figures. So in this case, we have animals, we have dancing women. Oh, that's very lascivious. We have a man, it looks like the man on the left holding something in his hands. I think that's a musical instrument. I may be wrong. And one of the most famous of all the images is the musical bear. So here we have a bear that's holding, it's not a mandolin or a banjo, it's some sort of stringed instrument. So we have a musical bear. And obviously this is centuries before Russian circuses, where actually, bears are made to do all these things. But it's cute, it's entertaining. Obviously it's badly destroyed, but you can imagine the ceiling with all the animals and all the silliness and the dancing women and the musicians and the birds and other animals. It probably was very entertaining for people who had spent a whole day traveling across the desert in the bright sun, and now they're in this little room of wonder with beautiful paintings on the ceiling that entertain and delight. So you have the religious narrative, and then you have the need for a visual stimulation that exists in any country. So here we have another one of these caravan stops, again in the areas of eastern Jordan. There's an image of a woman. So you have a little bit of an hourglass figure, a little bit of sensuality, though not much. It's very two-dimensional. It actually looks like an early 20th century painting by an artist like Modigliani or somebody else like that. But these things do exist. So I don't want people to get the impression that this did not exist, that people did not have images of humans and the world, and they did not delight in the beauty of the world. That did exist during the Umayyad period. So here's another woman with her arms up. We see the breasts, jewelry around her wrists, on her arms, a little bit of a, how to call it? It's not a harness, but decoration around her torso. The most famous is this mosaic from, again, the same area. And it's a representation of, I don't know if it's daily life, but a lion who is attacking gazelles or deers underneath a large tree. This is Kirbat al-Mifjar, again, one of these desert sites, and gives a sense of an oasis of plenty of luxuriance in a nature context. The tree is beautiful. A little bit of like what we saw in India, but I don't want to make comparisons. This is much, much earlier. But the sense of the leaves are in different values. Some are very light in color, some are very dark in color. Some of the leaves are very yellow, beige, tan, and then we have a little more subtle green, then we have darker green, then we have very dark green to give a sense of contrast in terms of depth. So those leaves and branches that are the lightest, the highest value, the gold, seem to be closer to us, and those that are darker, lower value shades of green seem to be further and further away. So you get a real good sense of layering into depth of those various branches. We have edge shading. We've discussed that before. You have edge shading on the deers. You have edge shading on the lion. Of course, the depth isn't good. Is it inside, outside? You don't have a sky. You don't have a ground line. The animals seem to be floating. They're not, as I said, grounded on anything secure. It is a mosaic. So it's many pieces of little stone that have been cemented together to create this image. But again, it is a representation of that ideal oasis that awaits everybody if they are able to get into heaven. So we have one large palace that survived. So this is Mashhad. This palace, again in Jordan, in the first half of the 700s. So this is built on, it may look a little bit like Muhammad's house with the perimeter walls, the open interior courtyard, and the rooms on one end. But it's also, a fortification concept that goes back to ancient Persia, the Sasanians, and other Middle Eastern cultures. Very little or nothing exists of it on site. When the archaeologists arrived centuries ago, they took many of the walls to museums in Europe, and that's what we see here, mostly in Germany. We see the walls of this palace at Mashhad. Maybe this is from the decree, it's all vegetation. So I want to show you that late in the Umayyad period, maybe we do have that transition and everything now is going to be vegetation and geometric forms. Now, geometry is beautiful, mathematics are beautiful, it is the perfect science, regardless of whether you are Chinese, Indian, Australian, Algerian, Brazilian, whatever the context, whatever your religion, whatever your belief system, math is math. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Hypotenuse, right triangle. In mathematics, there are universal truths that transcend time and place. So geometry is close to godliness, and that is believed in many societies. So therefore, a sense of geometric abstraction, geometric shapes, a sense of mathematical formulas, patterns are all very prevalent in much paradise imagery. So we have some details here of the reliefs from Mashata. And what's important is this is what we're going to expect going forward. Now, these are blocks of stone that have been carved. So they're put together, they're carved, and then they're formally cemented together. You carve each block individually. You don't carve the blocks once they've been assembled into the building wall. But you can see you have your zigzag making a series of triangles. You have flower units that seem to be high relief projecting out of the surface. And then you have low relief vines and patterns that cover the space. It creates a lot of variety, a lot of light and shadow play, because again, like India, this is a sun-drenched area. So having objects that are very 3D versus sculptures that is very relatively flat, different levels of relief, give a very strong visual variety when hit by the sun. Obviously, being in Germany, inside, you don't get that sense of the play of the sunlight on the surfaces and the dramatic change of the impression. So here we're more detailed. Now when you see it more detailed, there are animals inhabiting those vines, animals inhabiting those oases. Some of the animals may be mythical. You have like griffins, so like mammals with wings, a lot of lions, felines, because of their majesty and admiration for their power and their speed. So these are inhabited vines, inhabited forests, inhabited oases that, again, with a luxuriance, it's horror vacui. Use horror vacui for this as well. Every square centimeter on that wall is filled with life. And that is the absolute opposite to the desert. So here's another detail. It looks like some sort of bird on the right, like a rooster, with maybe that's a lion on the left. But that horror vacui sense of tremendous plenty, tremendous fertility, overabundance. Every branch, every plant has an abundance of flowers or hanging fruit or berries. Everything is to an excess. But again, this is the ideal of heaven. Another example, 2 lions drinking out of a pot of plenty. And I just want to end with 2 other sculptural images. Shows this bronze image of is it a deer or a horse or some sort of combination? Obviously, when we're talking about the Umayyad dynasty, we have Damascus, we have Jerusalem, we have relationships with the big cities in Saudi Arabia, with Mecca and Medina. There is a tremendous amount of urban wealth and urban display. And when you have these international cosmopolitan cultures, because Damascus has always been on the crossroads, when you have these international cosmopolitan cultures, it is going to lead to a luxury market of goods. So obviously very few of them survive because they could easily be melted down in later centuries to be used for the manufacture of a variety of objects. So there are a couple from the Umayyad that represent a sense of wealth and prosperity that would be a very important aspect of the urban culture. The most famous of these objects, again, is a water urn or canteen, or the word that we use, again, it goes back to Catholicism, is an eur, E-W-E-R, E-W-E-R. And it's a luxury object made out of metal for water, generally. It wouldn't be for oil, it isn't for cooking, but it is designed more for display rather than function. And ewers, as fancy as this, we see a bird like a rooster as the spout, a very fancy handle. These are also very common in Roman Catholic churches, where we have these beautiful objects for use during the liturgy, during the prayer ceremonies. So these are associated with royalty, they're associated with religious ritual, but also represent a sense of craftsmanship and luxury object market. But again, the animal is very abstract, the animal is very simplified. It's a beautiful sense of the tail feathers balancing out the movement of the head. You have the head and the neck curving towards the left, the tail feathers are curving to the right. So it's a very sophisticated concept. But again, as we've seen repeatedly in this course, nothing here is about anatomy, about muscular and skeletal structures. Nothing is about the details of observed scientific reasoning and analysis. It is nature in its most abstract form, as shapes, as lines of movement, as patterns, because these images are not duplicates of physical reality. Maybe that's where they get under the wire in terms of the third commandment. It's not a duplication of God's creation. It's an abstraction, a simplification of God's creation. And in that way, you're not competing with God himself. Okay? So that concludes our introduction to Islam and the introduction to the First Dynasty, Umayyad art, and the various issues related to Islamic visual representation. Thank you.